Today I'm going to speak about an idea that I find absolutely fascinating and an idea that's really useful not only for us as individuals but society at large. It's something we really need a dose of at the moment, especially with the kind of culture wars and social media and the polarization of right and left and libertarianism and statism. I think we need a real dose of skepticism in our lives. And I don't mean skepticism in the modern sense of the word. What skepticism tends to mean in the modern world is non-belief, not believing in particular states of affairs. Actually, skepticism, the word, comes from the ancient Greek word skepsis, which means to inquire. So skepticism in the ancient sense of the word is really about inquiry, about weighing things up, rather than actually not believing in something in the first place. Now, one of the problems that we have at the moment, especially with the polarization of people's viewpoints and the kind of clashes that we get in society, as well as sometimes our kind of mental health as well, is we have a problem with certainty and truth. And it's a major problem that people hold on to certainties. They cling on to them for dear life because they believe that, there's a kind of refuge in these certainties. But actually, truth and certainty can be quite harming to our mental health. Now, the ancient skeptics saw truth as a real problem, right? We process the reality through our senses and then in our mind, and there's a problem with that. Reality is actually at an arm's length from our minds. So we kind of have our body and our and organs like the brain that are in the way. And this ancient skeptics believe that we don't have access to the truth. Truth needs a kind of criterion or yardstick, and human beings simply don't have access to that. Every kind of truth we know is truth that's been transmitted us in some kind of way through our senses. The skeptics instead believe that there is therefore no access to truth, so everything is of a kind of equivalent value. So you can't say for sure how any kind of particular state of the world is. But that leads to a problem. And the problem is, how do you lead a life worth living if you don't actually believe in anything? So, for example, we have to believe that fire can hurt us if we touch it, right? If we're going to live any kind of meaningful and safe life, it just doesn't make sense to to not actually consent to any kind of belief. Beliefs are actually important for us to just get on with life. I need to believe that the sun's going to rise tomorrow, for example, just to be able to make plans. Now, the issue is tackled by one of the most prominent skeptics, right? A man named Carneades actually came onto the scene in the 2nd century BC. And Carneades is a really fascinating figure. He actually didn't leave any writing behind, but he did get written about quite a lot in some of the kind of testimonies. And there's a really fantastic story actually of Carneades visiting Rome as a diplomat sent by Athens. And the Romans were absolutely fascinated by Athenian philosophy and Greek philosophy. And they asked all the Greek philosophers to do lectures. And Carneades got up one day and did a fantastic lecture about the natural law that underpins Roman law and how Roman law was so profoundly right and just and the Romans had it all worked out. And then the next day he did a lecture and made the complete opposite point. He said that laws have no basis in any kind of natural justice. Laws are meaningless, and Roman law in particular is the worst kind of law because it's just based on brutality and strength. And this absolutely outraged Romans. What really outraged them was not necessarily the second lecture that went against the first lecture, But the fact that Carneades actually openly questions that we can access any kind of truth at all by opposing two truths equally against each other. And that was a real skill of the skeptic school of philosophy in ancient Greece. So Carneades tackled this problem of how do we live if none of our beliefs are valid. What he did is he suggested this idea called Pithanon. And Pithanon is an idea where we look at things based on their plausibility, right? So it's plausible that fire will burn me, because I've heard testimony from so many different people, and I've actually been burned myself a number of times, that I know there's a high chance of being burnt by fire in the future. And this sounds kind of dry and academic, but it's a really interesting way of looking at every eventuality and every belief in your life as a matter of plausibility on a scale between 0.01% and 99.99%, rather than anything being 100% truth or 0% falsity. It allows us to more skillfully and thoughtfully weigh up all the kind of possibilities that we're faced with. And it also works in a negative way. If we're talking to someone who really hold a strong belief, we could say to them, we can use Pithanon as a kind of way of argumentation and say, yeah, sure, like what you're saying is plausible, but it's not necessarily true. It's not a certainty. It's not 100% certainty. So we can be sure that, 99.99% that the sun will rise tomorrow, but we can't be certain of it. And the same can be said of any other kind of belief or claim to truth. And this not only helps us as a society actually negotiate and manage opposing beliefs, it's also interesting in that it helps us reach that state, what the skeptics called ataraxia. Ataraxia is a kind of serenity that you can get when you're no longer kind of anxious about any moment or possibility in the future. You can now think of things in terms of probability, and then think about how you can manage that probability. A good example is if there's a high probability that a government that I don't want to be in power will come into power. How would I manage that probability? Like that, thinking of it in the first place as a probability rather than a certainty helps me manage my anxiety levels, but also empowers me to kind of act on this idea that I can shift a probability by taking some course of action. So there's something really powerful about that and really useful. I wrote an essay about Carneades and Skepticism and Pithanon and how it could be really useful to your life. So if you want a much more detailed examination of this concept, click on the link below and you'll find that. Thank you so much. I think the idea is really helpful for me, and I hope it's helpful to you. Cheers.